healing practices, had never heard of these kind of rebound effects. He'd heard of many groups. I mean, every major religion has circles. Catholics and Protestants do prayer circles, going back to Teresa de Avila, and probably earlier. Certainly many indigenous traditions use circles. The Muslims they make a circle around the Kaaba. Jews they have minions where they have at least 10 men have to be present for someone to be healed. And so all of these ideas of praying in circles are in all of the religions. But what I didn't see was rebound effects, and also the huge rebound effects I found when people gathered together with the intention experiments. I mean, that was the biggest shock, I think, of all.
Because there you've got thousands of people coming together. Sometimes the first time you did it, that was so expensive computationally, and it was incredible what you pulled off. But now you found a more streamlined, efficient way to still bring thousands of people together. And how do you...
Well, now it's so easy, Cynthia, because back when we started, you had to rent all of this huge, server power. I mean, at one point we rented the server... we rented from the same company that supplied server power to Pop Idol, so we were taking no chances. But now you can just run it off of YouTube and just use their servers. So for me, though, was amazing was back in 2008 when we ran our first peace intention experiment, and there we had about 15,000 people participating, and we were sending intention to Sri Lanka, which was in the middle of a civil war. And I decided to survey the participants basically to see how easy it was for them to come on my website and do this intention. We had a website with flipping pages, so everyone would be seeing the same things at the same time and doing the same stuff, following the instructions at the same time. So I was just really curious about that and how they experienced it. And I got back thousands of replies from people saying things like, I felt like I was part of a higher network. I was crying uncontrollably, and I had goosebumps up and down my arms. I felt like I was in the tractor beam of Star Trek, and on and on and on, like they'd had some sort of amazing mystical experience. And I even looked at the conditions for mystical experiences and found that they were experiencing every one of these different kinds of states. But then the weirdest thing happened when they talked about what had happened in their lives, and they talked about how they'd had estranged relationships with partners or relatives, and they were being resolved or had been resolved. They were getting along better with their bosses and their coworkers. They were getting along better with their families. But mostly, about half of these people said, I'm more in love with everybody I come in contact with. Essentially they were hugging strangers. So I was completely blown away by this. And I saw a similar thing when we tried to do a healing experiment for a Gulf War veteran who was suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, it looked like we had a big effect on this guy, Todd Voss, because he never went for treatment after that. He went traveling, whereas before he was so hypervigilant, he couldn't really even go into a room without backing into it. And his life completely reversed. But what was really weird was, again, the thousands of participants who were on this intention wrote afterward to say they had been healed. People who were due for a hip or a knee replacement, had no more pain. People who had terrible gut problems were cleared. The same kinds of things, on and on and on. People with vision problems were much improved, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it occurred to me that there was some really weird process going on whereby if the focus was on peace, people's lives became more peaceful. If the focus was on healing, they themselves were healed. So there was this extraordinary mirror effect that continued to happen.
And you talk about the mirror effect, and so that's what you mean by it, that what the focus is, the practitioners receive. And you also mentioned rebound effect. Could you sort that out for listeners so they can tell what you mean, what the difference is?
It's essentially the same. I mean, rebound, I guess I used more with the small groups, where when they were sending intention to a member of the group, their life, the sender's lives, would be improved in some way. So like I talked about with Andy, when she started sending intention, in that case it was to Luke, that 15-year-old boy, then she suddenly gets this dream job. And the same thing with, I remember a woman, Lisa, who was really stuck with this book project. She wanted her book, she was a bodywork practitioner who developed a system of treating patients with trauma through bodywork, and she wanted to write a book, but she had been it was really stalled because she didn't know how to write. She'd gone through a couple of editors and was really worried about the whole marketing procedure. So again, her group was sending intention to her over and over, and it wasn't working, and I finally said, Lisa, get off of yourself. And so she started intending to a woman with big financial problems in her group, and the very next week, Lisa gets this unbelievable urge to go into a store that she doesn't even need to buy anything from. But while she's in there, she meets a woman she had been introduced before, and so they got chatting, and it turned out the woman was a former publisher who was now a book coach, and she offered, when she heard Lisa's project, she offered to coach her through the whole thing. She did, and fast forward, Lisa's book became an Amazon bestseller.
Awesome.
So it happened over and over again, this kind of amazing, get off of yourself, intend for someone else, and your life seems to get healed.
Right. And now my listeners understand I love quantum physics, and so we're going to go just lightly into a couple of ideas.
Sure.
So
sure.
I'd like to talk about the quantum concept of entanglement and how you're seeing evidence of this when we observe these Power of 8 groups.
My best example of non-locality, and non-locality, as your listeners no doubt have heard from you, is a little bit like, it's when quantum particles are essentially come into contact. No matter how far you move one away, or even, if they're a little bit like twins separated at birth, if you move one to New York and the other one to London, they continue to know about and be affected by each other across time and space, essentially. And, think about one, they both like the same color blue, they both marry the same person's name, with the same name, called Jane, for instance, and if one is falls down and breaks his leg, the other one does too, even though he or she is just sitting there in Starbucks drinking a latte.
It's funny you mention that, because it reminds me of twin studies where they find twins who are adopted at birth, and then weirdly, like, it's just so many coincidences have occurred in their lifetimes. By the time they notice these people.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Well, this is what a quantum, pair of quantum particles are, and that's what non-locality is.
Yes.
They are affected by each other across all space, and we saw that. We had a perfect demonstration of that with one of our intention experiments. It was one of the early ones. We were trying to make seeds grow faster, and I was working with Dr. Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona, and we decided to run the first one when I was going to be speaking in front of a group of about 700 in Sydney, Australia. So Gary and his lab in Tucson, Arizona, prepared 4 sets of 30 seeds each, and they labeled them A, B, C, or D, photographed them, sent me all 4 photos. I randomly chose one of the photos, or I think I let my audience choose one of the photos for us to send intention to. We didn't tell the scientists which ones we'd chosen. Let's say it was D. We sent our intention to seeds D, and then after we were finished, we told the scientists we were done, which was their signal to plant the seeds and then measure them 5 days later. And only after they'd completed their measurements did I unblind the study and tell them, yeah, it was it was seeds D. Well, it turned out the seeds that were seeds D grew significantly higher than the 3 other sets of controls. And that happened in the 5 other studies we ran like this in Rhinebeck, New York, in South Carolina, in Dallas, Texas, in LA, and then over the internet with thousands of my followers. So here's the really interesting thing, though, to unpack. With that first study, for instance, and by the way, with every single study that we ran, the seed scent intention grew significantly higher than controls, all 6. So here's the cool thing. With that one in Sydney, for instance. So we're in Sydney, Australia, and the seeds are sitting there in Tucson, Arizona, 8,000 miles away. Nevertheless, we have an effect. And we are also not sending intention to the thing. We're sending intention to a symbol of the thing. It's photographic representation. Nevertheless, we're still having an effect on that target. So that, to me, is an extraordinary demonstration of non-locality, and that it works with consciousness, that consciousness is able to zero in on a target, even via a symbol, and have an extraordinary effect.
And I think that that's a huge, huge piece of what you've been noticing, as well as the other one that you've mentioned so far that I didn't want to interrupt what you were saying, but the idea of coherence came up when you were talking about focusing on one intention, or the way that some of the Buddhist monks have been able to usually take an hour or so to get into that zone, that you're able to get people into what we might call a state of coherence really quickly. So
yes, that is an extraordinary thing. It is just a kind of a group mind where you are creating a resonance effect. I mean, they've seen that in some studies. For instance, guitarists. When guitarists are playing a piece of jazz, let's say, they've done studies showing that their brainwaves start operating in synchrony. So we see that with certain studies like that. But what's extraordinary, I think, with the Power of 8 groups is that people lose their individuality, and they behave essentially like a batch of quantum particles that are coherent. And coherent, which is used in a lot of different ways.
Yes.
But in science, in physics, really means that subatomic particles, which are also essentially waves, they're vibrating packets of energy, begin to lose their individuality and start operating like one giant wave. And that really increases the signal. And so in a way, with this Power of 8 group situation or intention experiment situation, we begin to lose our individuality, and it seems like our signal gets amplified too.
And maybe, just so people don't panic, we don't literally mean that you lose your individuality. I think of it, when I experience this sort of thing, I feel like I'm gaining something. It doesn't feel like loss. So if anyone's listening and they're like, uh-oh, I don't want to do that.
Absolutely. Good point, Cynthia. Yeah, and we're talking about something momentary. You go back to your singular self right after the end of the intention, but it doesn't feel bad or scary. It feels like bliss. I mean, almost everybody talks about this extraordinary blissful feeling, these extraordinary visions they have. And what happens over and over in these groups is that people begin to have the same vision. So I've had groups where one after another report the same visualizations that they had for someone they're intending for. I mean, one, it was amazing. She had some back issues, and most of the group had the same image of her spine lifted out of her body and being infused with light and then going back in. And it was something that was interesting and different enough where you couldn't say, oh, well, of course, they would all think the same thing. And there have been many, many other situations like that, too, where people have shared. It was almost like a shared mind for a while. But then, as soon as they're out of the circle, they go back to their individual selves. So there's no danger of permanently losing your individuality, none whatsoever.
And I love how you're taking the work you've done previously just one more step, because I remember when reading your book, The Bond, I was so impressed at that time with the positive health advantages that you were reporting in close-knit communities, such as in Japan and Rosito, Pennsylvania. There's even a term, Rosito effect, to describe the phenomenon by which a close-knit community experiences, for example, a reduced rate of heart disease. But now, what would you say? I mean, you're always growing. You're challenging, pushing the